All right, today we're going deep, really deep into World War II.
Sounds good.
But
Oh.
it's not the usual stuff you hear about, you know. We're looking at the British Empire, and we've got excerpts from this article, and it talks about all these different countries, all these different people, all part of the empire, and what they did in the war. I mean, everyone knows about Britain and the U.S., right?
Right.
But what about all the others? Millions of people all over the world fighting in this global conflict. It's amazing when you think about it.
It really is. You know, the British Empire was massive.
Yeah.
And their involvement in the war, it was truly global. Millions of people from every corner of the globe. Their stories, though, they often get overlooked.
Yeah, for sure. And that's what I'm hoping we can, like, uncover a bit today.
Yeah.
There's even stuff in here about Indian soldiers fighting at Gallipoli.
Oh, wow.
Decades before World War II even started.
Right.
And a South African unit that was actually banned from combat because of their race. Yeah, it's crazy. So much to unpack.
Yeah.
But I guess to start, I mean, World War II wasn't the first time Britain, you know, asked for help from the empire.
No, not at all. You're right. In World War I, India, for example, played a massive role.
Oh, yeah. Huge numbers of troops, right?
Absolutely. Over 1.5 million Indian troops in World War I. They fought in so many different places and made a real difference. One example that stands out is Gallipoli.
Gallipoli, 1915. Wasn't that a disaster?
What for the Allies?
Yeah.
British and Empire forces, they were trying to, well, the whole point was to capture the Gallipoli Peninsula in Turkey. Strategically really important. It would have given them control of the Dardanelles Strait, which connects the Mediterranean to the Black Sea.
Okay, yeah.
And the goal was to open up a supply route to Russia.
Oh, right.
The problem was, well, the Ottomans. Allied with Germany, they put up fierce resistance,
Yeah.
tough terrain, and the whole campaign really badly planned and executed.
So how did the Indian troops do in all that?
It was rough. Casualties were really high. Over half the Indian troops deployed there were killed.
Wow.
It's a real testament to the sacrifices made by soldiers from the empire, you know, even in a campaign that ultimately failed.
Yeah. Fighting and dying so far from home.
Yeah.
It's a powerful reminder of the human cost of war.
Yeah.
For everyone involved.
It really is. And you know, this is a good point to talk about the Victoria Cross,
Right.
Britain's highest military decoration.
Oh, yeah, right. For, like, extraordinary courage.
Right. You know, in the face of the enemy.
I think I remember learning about this. Didn't an Indian soldier become one of the first South Asians to receive the Victoria Cross?
Yes. His name was Khuddadad Khan. And in 1915, he became the first South Asian recipient.
Wow.
He was a machine gunner at the Battle of Neuve-Chapelle in France. His entire unit was wiped out.
Oh, wow.
But he single-handedly held off the advancing German troops, gave his battalion time to regroup, saved countless lives.
That's incredible.
It is.
Real heroism. So even, you know, decades before World War II, the British Empire, relying heavily on soldiers from its colonies. So when World War II broke out, what was going on in India?
Well, in 1939, India was still part of the British Empire.
Right.
So the decision to join the war, made in London, by the British government, not in Delhi.
So they didn't really have a say.
Unfortunately, no. It's a complicated situation, especially as the war went on and the movement for Indian independence grew stronger.
Yeah.
But even without, you know, autonomy, the Indian people really stepped up.
What do you mean?
The British Indian Army. At the start of the war, about 250,000 volunteers. By the end, over 2.5 million.
10 times larger. That's incredible.
It is a huge commitment to the war effort. Indian soldiers, they earned 30 Victoria Crosses during the war. And tragically, over 87,000 of them died, fighting on multiple fronts.
Multiple fronts. Where were they fighting?
All over the world. North Africa, against Rommel's forces. In the deserts, Southeast Asia, facing the Japanese, Italy, pushing up the peninsula, alongside other Allied forces, even the Middle East, securing oil supplies and key strategic locations. Every theater of war, really.
It sounds like they were essential to the Allied war effort.
Absolutely. Manpower, strategic positioning, willingness to fight in all these different difficult environments,
Yeah.
all crucial to the Allied victory.
But I imagine this created some tricky political dynamics, right? I mean, fighting for the British Empire while also pushing for independence.
Oh, for sure. One of the big tensions of this period, some in India argued that, you know, if they were supporting the war effort,
Yeah.
putting their lives on the line, then they should be granted independence.
Makes sense. What did the British government say to that?
They rejected the idea. which, you know, only added fuel to the fire. The struggle for Indian independence continued.
Right.
It's a complicated issue. Even within this global conflict, you have these internal political struggles playing out.
Yeah, for sure. And then there's the Bengal famine. 1943, millions died from starvation.
Oh, yeah. A horrific event. Up to 3 million people in Bengal died during that time.
What caused it? Was it just like a natural disaster?
A combination of things, and there's debate about how much British policies contributed.
Right.
Natural factors played a role. Cyclones, flooding, impacted food production. But then you have the impact of wartime policies. Grain requisitioning, the British government diverting food to support the war effort, and the denial policy, removing rice and other supplies from coastal areas to prevent the Japanese from getting them.
Right. So these policies meant to help the war effort. They actually made the famine worse.
That's what some historians argue.
Wow.
These policies, combined with economic inequality and disrupted trade, all caused by the war, of course, created a perfect storm that led to mass starvation in Bengal.
So even in a global war, these internal challenges, these policy decisions can have devastating consequences.
Yeah, a stark reminder of the complexities of wartime.
So we've talked a lot about India, but the British Empire was much bigger than just India.
Oh, yeah.
What about other parts of the empire? What was their experience?
A lot of groups played vital roles. Important to understand their stories, too.
Like the Gurkhas. I've always been fascinated by them. Incredible soldiers. Ferocious. Did they fight in World War II, too?
Absolutely. The Gurkhas, soldiers from Nepal, a long history of serving in the British Army. World War II, no exception. They were known for their courage, loyalty, and their mastery of the kukuri, a curved knife. It became a symbol of their fighting skill.
So where do they mainly serve?
All over, from the mountains of Italy to the jungles of Burma, campaigns in North Africa, Greece, even the Far East.
That's incredible. They were known for their bravery, right?
Oh, yeah. Willing to take on incredibly dangerous missions.
Do we know how many served in the war?
Over 110,000 Gurkhas.
Wow.
In 40 different battalions. Sadly, around 30,000 were killed or wounded.
Wow.
They earned 12 Victoria Crosses, too, 5 posthumously.
Wow. So they fought in Burma, you said, against the Japanese.
Yes. They were key in the Burma campaign.
What's so important about Burma?
Well, Burma, present-day Myanmar, shared a border with India, strategically crucial for the British. The Japanese wanted to capture it, cut off supply lines to China, gain a foothold in Southeast Asia.
Okay.
The fighting in Burma was brutal, jungle warfare, challenging for everyone involved.
The Gurkhas, with their mountain warfare skills, they must have been in their element.
Exactly. Their skills and experience, invaluable, navigating tough terrain, resilience in harsh conditions, effective in close combat.
Soldiers from the Himalayas fighting in the jungles of Burma.
For the British Empire. It really shows how global this conflict was, drawing in people from all over.
It does. The Burma campaign was a melting pot. Cultures and nationalities, soldiers from Britain, India, Nepal, Africa, all fighting side by side against a common enemy.
It makes you wonder what it must have been like for them, fighting so far from home.
Yeah. Disorienting. Terrifying, I'm sure. But also, you know, exposing them to new cultures, new landscapes, new ways of life.
Maybe even changing their view of the world. Potentially. Wartime experiences. Traumatic, yes, but also transformative. Challenging assumptions, broadening horizons, forcing people to confront the world outside their own communities.
So we've talked about India, the Gurkhas. What about other regions? The Caribbean, for example.
Yeah, the Caribbean colonies contributed too. But their experience is often marked by discrimination and inequality.
Really?
Yeah. For one, the Caribbean Regiment, it wasn't even formed until April 1944.
Late in the war. Why then?
A combination of factors, I think. The need for manpower as the war dragged on, and pressure from the Caribbean colonies themselves to be more directly involved in the fight against fascism.
Okay, so how many served?
About 10,000 volunteers from various islands. They fought in Italy, the Middle East, mainly in support roles, though.
Support roles.
Yeah. Construction, transportation, logistics, not on the front lines, which is a reflection of the racial discrimination still prevalent in the British military.
You mean even though these soldiers were risking their lives for the empire?
Sadly, yes. Often treated as second-class citizens.
What kind of discrimination are we talking about?
Well, black people, they were allowed to serve in the Royal Air Force, but banned from the Royal Navy.
Really? Even while fighting a war against, the Nazis were known for their racial hatred.
It's true. Even while fighting tyranny abroad, the British Empire still had its own problems with racism, inequality.
What about the Merchant Navy? the sailors transporting supplies across the Atlantic?
Same story. Sailors from the British Empire often paid much less than their white counterparts. Dangerous work, facing U-boats, terrible conditions, but not treated as equals.
It's hard to believe, even in a crisis, supposedly united, these systemic inequalities persist.
They do. We need to acknowledge these injustices when we talk about this period of history, not about erasing the contributions, but understanding the whole picture, the complexities.
Okay, so we've covered India, the Gurkhas, the Caribbean. What about Africa?
The British Army recruited heavily in Africa, East and West Africa, a lot of the recruits, attracted by the higher pay, compared to what they could earn locally, a chance to support their families.
Do we know how many were recruited?
320,000 men from East Africa.
Wow.
And another 200,000 from West Africa, sent to campaigns in Africa, the Middle East, even Southeast Asia. Crucial roles: logistics, transportation, combat.
So even with that, with so many recruits, were there still disparities in how they were treated?
Unfortunately, yes. Lots of examples of racial discrimination and unequal treatment. South Africa is one of the most striking examples.
South Africa. I think I read somewhere they had a complicated relationship with Britain during the war.
Oh, very complicated. There was a big debate in South Africa about joining the war at all.
Why?
A lot of anti-British sentiment.
Really? Why?
The legacy of the Boer Wars.
Yeah.
Fought between the British and the Boers, descendants of Dutch settlers, a lot of resentment, mistrust, and a growing movement for South Africa to become a republic, independent from Britain.
So joining the war, big decision.
It caused a political crisis. But on September 6, 1939, just days after Britain declared war on Germany, South Africa did too.
So they were in from the start.
Yeah. But deep divisions remained, and government policies reflected that.
What kind of policies?
Well, the most notable was the ban on Black South African soldiers fighting on the front lines, only allowed to serve in support roles. Administration.
They weren't allowed to fight.
Not in combat roles. Blatant racial discrimination. Same ideology that would lead to apartheid after the war.
So they believed Black South Africans were inferior, not capable of fighting.
Exactly. Reflecting the deep racial hierarchies that existed in South Africa.
Fighting against the evils of Nazism, and yet
Yeah.
still racism within the Allied ranks.
Yeah.
Did this ban on Black South African soldiers ever change?
Yes, but not for the right reasons. By 1941, the need for more soldiers was so great.
They needed everyone they could get.
They did. They couldn't afford to exclude such a large part of the population, so they changed the policy, but only out of necessity, not principle.
So were they allowed to fight then, on the front lines?
Still not allowed in combat. But they were allowed in a wider range of support positions. Drivers, dispatch riders, medics, stretcher bearers, essential roles, keeping the army going.
So it's progress, but still.
Yeah, a bleak reflection of the racism of the time. Progress is often slow, painful, sometimes driven by necessity, not a commitment to justice.
So we've talked about India, Gurkhas, Caribbean, Africa. What about Australia and New Zealand, down under?
Both were significant players, involved in both Europe and the Pacific.
I know Australia is a big country, but not a huge population. What was their involvement like?
Australia declared war on Germany, alongside Britain, September 3rd, 1939. Over 1 million Australians served.
1 million out of what, maybe 7 million people?
Yeah.
That's a big commitment. Where did they fight at the beginning of the war?
Europe, North Africa, alongside British forces.
And after Japan entered the war?
That's when things shifted to the Pacific.
Yeah.
They declared war on Japan separately. They faced a real threat of invasion, so they moved most of their forces to the Pacific to defend their homeland, push back against Japan.
It must have been a scary time for them, knowing they were a target.
It was. It led to a huge mobilization effort back home. Not just men going off to fight. Women played a vital role, too.
Oh, interesting. Can you give us some examples?
One fascinating story is Florence Violet Mackenzie.
Okay.
She founded the Women's Emergency Signaling Corps, WESC, in 1939, before the war even started.
What was that?
Well, she knew that if war came, there'd be a shortage of skilled signalers, because most men with those skills would be sent to fight. So she started training women. Morse code, semaphore.
That's amazing, thinking ahead like that.
Yeah. By the time war broke out, they had over 120 women ready to go.
Really?
And they ended up playing a crucial role in military communications throughout the war.
So they were working in military installations, relaying messages and stuff.
Exactly. They even trained male members of the armed forces in communication skills.
Wow. So they were taking on these roles traditionally done by men.
Yeah, really flipping the script.
Any other examples like that?
The Australian Women's Land Army, AWLA, started in July 1942. Food production was crucial with so many men away.
Right. So these women, they were like running the farms.
Exactly.
Ah.
Planting and harvesting, tending livestock, operating machinery. By 1944, the AWLA had about 3,000 members. Really kept the country fed during a tough time.
It's amazing how women stepped up,
Yep.
kept things going. What about New Zealand?
New Zealand, even though it was a small country, they made a big contribution.
I'd imagine they were mainly involved in the Pacific, right?
Yeah, they were, fighting alongside Australia and the U.S. But what's interesting about New Zealand, they willingly put their Navy and Air Force under British command.
Oh, really?
Yeah, unlike most other places of the empire. So a lot of New Zealanders served in the Royal Air Force. They even provided 30 Wellington bombers to the RAF.
That's a big contribution for a small country.
It is, and we can't forget about Maori and Pacific Islander troops from New Zealand, too.
Oh, right. The Maori Battalion. I've heard about them. They were really brave, right?
They were. Almost 16,000 Maori enlisted. Many served in the 28th Maori Battalion. They fought in Greece, Crete, North Africa, renowned for their fighting spirit.
I read a story about a Maori soldier who won the Victoria Cross.
Te Moana Nui Akiwa Ngarimu in 1943.
Yeah.
Extraordinary bravery during a battle in Tunisia. He charged a German machine gun post single-handedly, took out the gunners, captured the post, held it against repeated counterattacks.
That's amazing. It makes you wonder, what made these soldiers fight so fiercely, so far from home?
Sense of duty, loyalty, belief in what they were fighting for. It's hard to say for sure. But remarkable stories of courage. And Maori women were involved too, right? Like in Australia.
Yeah, exactly. Taking on new roles.
Absolutely. In 1942, the Maori War Effort Organization was formed, gave Maori women a way to contribute, working in factories, shipyards, organizing shipments to soldiers overseas, supporting families back home. They were essential, kept things going. And there's the incredible story of Te Puia Harangi.
Who was that?
She was a leader in the Kingatanga movement, a Maori political movement. She was so active in fundraising for the war effort, organized dances, concerts, sold farm products to raise money for the Red Cross, tirelessly advocating for her people, determined to support the war.
It's incredible, isn't it? These individual stories of courage, determination, emerging from this massive conflict.
It's a reminder that even in a war involving millions, it's individuals, their actions that shape things.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. India, Nepal, the Caribbean, Africa, Australia, New Zealand. So many different parts of the world drawn into this conflict.
It truly was a global war.
And I guess we can't forget about Canada. What about their involvement?
Oh, Canada was a major player.
Yeah.
Huge contribution to the war effort, manpower, resources. They were one of the first countries to declare war on Germany, stayed involved throughout the whole thing.
I mean, Canada's a big country, but the population wasn't that big back then, was it? How many actually served in the war?
Over 1 million Canadians.
1 million.
Yeah. Fought in Europe, North Africa, the Atlantic, involved in some key battles, too. Battles that really influenced how the war played out.
Like what? Give us some examples.
Well, the Battle of the Atlantic, for one, a long, tough campaign, fought mainly at sea, Allied naval forces against German U-boats.
Oh, right, trying to control those shipping lanes.
Exactly.
To supply Britain.
Keep those supply lines open.
Oh.
The Royal Canadian Navy, they were crucial in protecting those convoys, escorting them across the Atlantic, fighting off U-boats.
That must have been so dangerous.
Oh, it was. The Atlantic was a dangerous place. The Canadian Navy suffered heavy losses. But their courage, their determination, essential, prevented Britain from being starved into submission.
So they were essentially keeping Britain alive.
In many ways, yes. And their success in the Battle of the Atlantic, absolutely crucial to the Allied victory overall.
Wow. What other battles?
Well, Canadian pilots, they played a vital role in the Battle of Britain, 1940.
Yes. The Battle of Britain. When the Luftwaffe was trying to destroy the RAF, take control of the skies. Wasn't that a turning point?
It was. First major defeat for Germany.
Yeah.
And it stopped them from invading Britain. Canadian pilots were right in the middle of it all, flying with British pilots, defending cities, airfields from those relentless German attacks.
I mean, what kind of impact did they have?
A big one. They brought experience, skill to the fight. helped tip the balance in favor of the RAF. And not just fighting, they trained a lot of RAF pilots, too.
Oh, right.
A lot of the British pilots, they didn't have much combat experience. The Canadians, a lot of them had been fighting since the beginning, so they shared their knowledge, got those new pilots up to speed.
That's amazing, these young men traveling across the Atlantic to fight in a war that, it might have seemed so far removed from their own lives. What do you think motivated them?
I think a sense of duty, a belief that they had to defend democracy, fight fascism, but maybe also a sense of adventure, a desire to test themselves against the best pilots in the world.
And then there's D-Day, June 1944. Were Canadians involved in that too?
Absolutely. A major part of the landings landed on Juno Beach, one of the 5 beaches targeted for the invasion.
Where was Juno?
Between the British beaches, Sword and Gold, right in the heart of the German defenses.
So they were facing some of the toughest resistance.
They were, and they suffered heavy losses. 359 Canadians killed on D-Day.
It's a lot. But they were successful in their objectives.
They were. Despite the casualties, they pushed inland, secured a crucial foothold for the Allied advance, a vital role in the success of D-Day.
It's remarkable. Fighting on land, sea, air, all over the world.
A massive contribution, but often overshadowed by the bigger Allied powers.
We've only just scratched the surface here. So much to talk about. Where do we even go from here?
I think the key thing to remember is just how global the war effort was, how diverse. The stories we've talked about, they're just a glimpse into this massive tapestry of experiences that make up World War II.
I'm thinking about all the individual stories within these big narratives, the personal journeys of these soldiers, the families back home, the communities impacted.
And these stories, they aren't just about the past. They affect how we understand the present, how we approach the future.
We should talk about that more.
Yeah, definitely. A lot to unpack here.
It's mind-boggling, isn't it? I mean, the sheer scale of it all. From World War I trenches to the deserts of North Africa, jungles of Burma, beaches of Normandy, all connected through this lens of the British Empire.
And it wasn't just about, being there, the sacrifices they made, the challenges they faced. It really challenges this idea that World War II is just a European thing.
It does. It's so fascinating. Just like opens up the whole narrative, makes you think about it in a new way. We always focus on the big players, the big battles. But these stories, they show you how global it really was.
Yeah, it's like, zooming out, seeing the full picture, understanding how it all connected every corner of the world.
So if we take a step back and think about all these contributions from different parts of the empire, what are the big takeaways for you?
Well, the sheer scale and diversity, right? Millions of people from all walks of life, every corner of the globe, drawn into this conflict, fighting for different reasons, often far from home, facing unimaginable hardships. It's hard to even grasp.
It really humanizes it, doesn't it? It wasn't just about armies. It was about people, families, communities caught up in this global storm.
Exactly. And their experiences, their sacrifices, their motivations, we need to understand them, acknowledge them.
Another thing that strikes me, how crucial their contributions were to the Allied victory. We always hear about Britain, the U.S., the Soviets, but the Empire's role, it's often downplayed.
Yeah, and that's not right. Without their manpower, resources, strategic locations, the outcome could have been very different. Think about North Africa, the fight against Rommel. Without Indian and Gurkha troops, or Burma, without soldiers from all across the empire.
It makes you wonder, what if? What if they hadn't been there?
It's a hypothetical, but it's worth thinking about. Their involvement was essential. If we want to understand how the war was won, we need to acknowledge that.
And it's not just about the fighting, right? It's the sacrifices at home, too. Women taking on those vital roles, communities changing and adapting.
Right. The war effort, it went way beyond the battlefields. Every part of life was affected. Women working in factories, building ships, families rationing, dealing with separation, communities coming together to support the troops. These things were just as important.
Total war.
Yeah, touching every aspect of society. And we have to remember that. It wasn't just about winning battles. It was about the resilience of everyday people facing extraordinary circumstances.
And speaking of extraordinary, these stories, they really challenge how we usually think about World War II. I know I tend to focus on Europe. It's kind of a Eurocentric view.
It's a common view, but it's limited. These stories, they remind us how global the war really was. People from all backgrounds, all cultures, playing a crucial role. We've seen how it unfolded in Africa and Asia and the Pacific, and that's just a part of it.
It really broadens your understanding, doesn't it? It's not just the traditional narrative. It forces you to see it from other perspectives, perspectives that are often left out.
Yeah, And it raises important questions about how we remember the war, commemorate it. How do we make sure everyone's contributions are recognized, honored? How do we move beyond this European focus?
That's a big question. It's about representation, historical accuracy, whose stories are told, whose stories are forgotten. We need to think about these things.
We do. It's about acknowledging all the experiences, the human experiences, during wartime, recognizing the sacrifices made by everyone, no matter who they were.
So we've talked about the scale, the diversity, the vital role of the empire in the Allied victory, and how it challenges this Eurocentric view of the war. What else stands out for you?
Well, even as we talk about these contributions, we can't ignore the complexities, the injustices that existed within the empire.
Right. The racial discrimination,
Right.
the Caribbean soldiers, the lower pay, the restrictions on their service, and black South African soldiers not being allowed to fight on the front lines.
Those are just two examples.
Yeah.
We also have to think about the political context, the independence movements, the legacy of colonialism. It's complicated.
It's a reminder that even in a fight against tyranny, oppression can still exist.
It can. And acknowledging that complexity is crucial for a nuanced understanding of history. We're not trying to erase the past or glorify it. We're trying to confront it, honestly, see all sides of it.
Learning from it, both the good and the bad.
Exactly, and using that knowledge to understand where we are now and to strive for a better future, a more just future.
That's a powerful thought. History isn't just about the past. It's about people, their choices, their struggles, their legacies, and how those legacies shape the world today.
That's right.
This has been really insightful. I'm thinking about all these stories, these personal journeys within the larger narratives. And I want to learn more. Where would you suggest our listeners start if they want to delve deeper into this?
Well, there's a lot of information out there. Start with the specific countries we've talked about. India, the Gurkhas, the Caribbean, Africa, Australia, New Zealand, Canada. Lots of books, articles, documentaries, even online resources. It's all there.
And what about those personal accounts? The individual stories?
Oh, those are essential.
Yeah.
Letters, diaries, oral histories, they give you that firsthand perspective, the realities of war, sacrifices made, the impact on people and communities. It brings history to life in a way that a textbook just can't.
Khuda Dad Khan, the Indian soldier who won the Victoria Cross, holding off the Germans all by himself. The Australian women training men in communication. The Maori War Effort Organization. Tipuya Harangi and her fundraising. So many amazing stories.
They are, and there are so many more out there waiting to be discovered. It's those individual stories that make history so compelling.
And it shows you, even in these big events, the actions of one person can have a huge impact.
And those ripples, they spread outward, shaping the course of history in ways we might not even fully understand.
It makes you think, doesn't it, about our own actions today and how they might be shaping the future. What will people say about us 100 years from now? What kind of legacy will we leave behind?
It is thought-provoking. We are living through history right now. Every choice we make, every action, every inaction, it all adds to the story, the human story.
History isn't just something that happened. It's happening now. We're all part of it.
And we have the power to shape it, for better or worse.
So as we get toward the end of our deep dive here, I'm wondering about the lasting impact of the British Empire's involvement. How did this global conflict change the world? What are the legacies that we're still dealing with?
It's a big question, no easy answers, but one of the most significant impacts was the decline of the British Empire itself.
Right. The war drained them, financially and in terms of manpower. And it showed their weaknesses, militarily, politically.
Exactly. And as the war went on, the calls for independence within the empire, they grew stronger, more insistent. A lot of the countries we've talked about, India, Pakistan, African nations, Caribbean nations, they all gained independence in the decades after the war. The war didn't directly cause it, but it definitely sped things up.
It's amazing how a global conflict can have these, ripple effects,
Right.
reshaping the world politically.
Yeah, like a chain reaction, and the consequences can be good and bad. You have the end of colonial empires, new nations emerging, but also new power struggles, new conflicts, new challenges as the world is redrawn.
And the rise of the U.S. and the Soviet Union as superpowers, that was a direct result of the war, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Europe was devastated, so the U.S. and the USSR, they became the dominant forces, militarily, ideologically, and that led to the Cold War, which shaped global politics for decades.
So the war created a vacuum, and these two nations stepped in to fill it.
In a way, yeah. And their rivalry, it affected everything. International relations, technology, even culture.
The Cold War, growing out of the ashes of World War II.
and shaping the second half of the 20th century, a long shadow over global politics, economics, culture.
The legacies of World War II, they go way beyond 1945. They still affect us today.
They do. And it's not just about politics and economics. It's about society, too. Culture. The war brought people together from different backgrounds in ways they'd never experienced before, on the battlefields and at home.
We saw that in the stories we talked about. Soldiers from all over the empire, fighting side by side, women from different cultures working together, people forced to confront their prejudices.
Right. And those interactions, they had a lasting impact. They contributed to the civil rights movements that came later. People who had fought for freedom abroad, they came home and demanded equality here.
Fighting fascism overseas, and then fighting for equality at home.
Exactly. And the contributions of soldiers from the empire, especially those who faced discrimination. It challenged those old racial hierarchies, made people see the hypocrisy, fighting for freedom while denying it to others.
And those conversations, those challenges, they're still going on today.
They are. Colonialism, racism, inequality, we're still grappling with these issues, and understanding the history is essential if we want to solve them.
So the war, in a way, it planted the seeds for a lot of the social and political movements that shape the world we live in now.
I think so. It was a catalyst for change in so many ways. It sped up trends that were already happening. It exposed contradictions, injustices. It made people rethink their assumptions about the world, about themselves.
There's so much more to learn about this period, about those individual stories, about how this global conflict changed everything. I want to dive in deeper.
It's worth exploring. The more we understand the past, the better we can understand the present and create a better future.
That's a good point to pause on. This has been an incredible journey, learning about stories that are often forgotten, and I'm already looking forward to our next deep dive.
Me too. There's always more to discover, more to unpack.
It's amazing when you think about it, how connected everything is. We've been talking about the British Empire and World War II, but it goes so much deeper. It's about colonialism, race, the fight for independence, global power shifts. It's all intertwined.
It really shows you how history, it's not just a straight line. It's more like a web. All these forces, ideas, actions, all connected, shaping each other.
And those forces, they don't just disappear when the war ends. They're still shaping the world today.
Absolutely. The echoes of World War II, they're everywhere. Politics, social movements, cultural identities, even the way global power is structured. It all goes back to the war.
So if we zoom out a bit, what are the biggest lasting impacts of the British Empire's involvement? How did it change the course of history?
Well, we talked about it earlier. The war definitely made the British Empire decline faster. It cost them so much. Lives, money, resources. It pushed them to their limits. And it also fueled those independence movements in the colonies. People had fought for freedom and democracy abroad, and then they came home and they wanted the same things for themselves.
So the war, in a way, it sowed the seeds for the empire's downfall.
Yeah, I think so. It exposed the contradictions of colonialism, fighting for freedom but denying it to others. And it gave those independence movements momentum, a moral argument, a political platform to demand self-determination.
And it wasn't just the British Empire. It changed the whole balance of power globally.
Absolutely. Europe was in ruins after the war.
Yeah.
And that created this vacuum. The U.S. and the Soviet Union, they stepped in. They became the superpowers, each with their own ideology, their own sphere of influence, their own ambitions.
So that led to the Cold War.
Exactly, the Cold War. It was a direct result of World War II. The clash between communism and capitalism, the nuclear arms race, all those proxy wars, it all goes back to the war and the way it changed the global power structure.
One thing leads to another, and the consequences, they just keep rippling outwards.
Like a domino effect. History is always in motion. It's a dynamic process. Nothing happens in isolation. Everything is connected. And the consequences, they can echo for generations.
Thinking about all of this global scale, I'm wondering about how the war changed how we think about race and identity.
That's an important point. The war brought people together from all over the world, different races, different cultures, in ways that it hadn't happened before, on the battlefields and back home.
We saw examples of that in the stories we talked about. Colonial troops fighting alongside British soldiers, women from different cultures, working together, people having to confront their own prejudices.
Right, and those interactions, they weren't always easy, but they challenged the old ways of thinking, the racial hierarchies. They sparked these conversations about equality, justice.
So the war, In a way, it paved the way for the civil rights movements. That came later.
I think so. It exposed the hypocrisy, fighting against Nazi racism, but having racial discrimination at home, and the soldiers who came back from fighting overseas. They wanted to change things. They wanted equality.
They had seen what was possible.
They had. And those demands for equality, they weren't just about race. The war also changed gender roles. Women had taken on these traditionally male roles in the workforce, in society.
These global events, they can be catalysts for social change. They challenge the old norms, and they push us to evolve.
It's true. And it reminds us that history, it's not just about the past. It's about understanding the present and shaping the future.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the British Empire and World War II, what's the one thing you hope our listener takes away from all of this?
I hope they understand how complex history is, how everything is connected. Events that seem far away or long ago, they can have a huge impact on our lives, even today.
History isn't just facts and dates, it's a story, a living story, and we're all part of it.
And we have the power to shape that story. By understanding the past, by listening to different voices, by questioning what we think we know, we can create a better future, a more just future, a more informed future.
I love that. That's a great place to end. Thank you for sharing your insights and for taking us on this journey. It's been really eye-opening.
It's been my pleasure. And remember, history is a conversation. It never really ends. Keep exploring, keep questioning, keep learning.